Welcome everybody to another in the series of Casiopa webinars. We have here today Claire Atherton, who actually is working with me at the University of Waterloo. And Claire is going to discuss her research and her efforts overall on birds and grasslands, the strategies for effective habitat restoration. And yes, I realize you can read that on the screen. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Claire. You'll see me disappear off the screen and unmute, and Claire is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be time for anybody who wants to ask any questions or have a discussion even at the end. Claire, take it away, my friend.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. Hi, everyone, and welcome to my presentation and to this webinar. As Steve briefly mentioned, I'm working right now part-time doing my Master's of Environmental Studies in Steve's lab at the University of Waterloo. And my thesis focuses on grasslands and grassland birds, specifically eastern meadowlark, and basically how that all fits into habitat restoration strategies in Ontario. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. If I can get my slides to advance, one moment. There we go. So grassland birds in Canada, short story, they're not doing that well. Last month, the Birds Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada released their latest version of the State of Canada's Birds Report. So this is a report that looks at the population trends of birds across Canada since 1970. And this latest report is a follow-up to one that they published in 2019. Now, this latest report shows, as you can see on this graph here, that grassland birds have declined by a whopping 67% in Canada since 1970. Now, we know from just the general outlay of Canada that a lot of grasslands are found in the prairie provinces, but we do have some grasslands here in Ontario as well. And for species like eastern meadowlark, for example, the majority of eastern meadowlark's range is just focused in Ontario and Quebec. And in the State of Canada's Birds Report, eastern meadowlark has declined by 84% since 1970. So it really is, this is species in particular is an example of one where Ontario really has to play a role. Now, the state of grasslands in Ontario, the picture is a little bit more complicated. Historically, southwestern Ontario, it's thought used to be a patchwork of grasslands and Carolinian forest. And current estimates right now show that there's about a 99% loss of those historical grasslands compared to today. And the reason for that is thought to be that when Europeans arrived, there was widespread deforestation and also conversion of those grasslands into hayfields and pastures for cattle and specifically beef production in Ontario. And that initially led to a large increase in grassland birds because those hayfields and pastures are kind of like a substitute system for those native grasslands because structurally they're very similar. Now, what's happened since is that agriculture in Ontario has moved away from beef production and more towards grain crops, which coincidentally has resulted in a decline of grassland birds. And so now what the picture is starting to say now is people are starting to restore those native grasslands in hopes of increasing grassland birds. So it's a little bit more complicated, and there's been lots of up and down over the centuries. So after learning this, I had a few questions that I wanted to look into. So first, I want to get a sense of what are current grassland restoration projects like in Ontario? And secondly, how can those projects be improved for the future? So the way I did this is I put out an online survey or questionnaire of so-called subject area experts about asking these questions for people working on grassland restoration projects in Ontario. Now, this was a COVID era study. So ideally, this kind of open-ended knowledge gathering study is really best done in an interview format. But with COVID, we didn't want to be face to face, so I did it as an online questionnaire. Um, and this graph here just shows a distribution or an overview of the associated the organizations that the respondents are associated with. So you can see we got a lot of responses from conservation authorities, people working at the federal government or nonprofits, and then a smattering of other ones from universities or colleges and consulting firms. So the first part of the survey, I wanted to just provide some context for the respondents' answers and just kind of just get a sense of what their knowledge was with the subjects that I was going to be asking, so I could contextualize their answers. And I found that most respondents were very familiar or extremely familiar with what restoration was, which is great. And then others up here were very familiar with grassland birds and tall grass prairies, which is a type of historical native grassland to southwestern Ontario. You'll see here as well that I do have a question about eastern meadowlark. This is just a note that this study that I did, since um, my thesis does focus on eastern meadowlark, there are some eastern meadowlark specific questions in my survey, but a lot of them were also broadened to include just asking questions about grasslands in general or grassland birds. So first question is about what are current grassland projects like? So I asked respondents to talk a little bit about what are some strengths of current or past projects. And I took their long form answers and I categorized them into different themes that arose from their answers about what were some strengths. And so these are a list of the themes here and the number of responses along the x-axis. And you can see that one of the strengths that was most people referred to was that current or past restoration projects have a really broad focus. So it's seen as a strength that these projects don't just focus on one species or one taxon. It really is focused on the ecosystem at large, the grassland type at large. And then another main strength seen was management, is that these projects are generally managed well, and that's a strong point. I also wanted to categorize these themes and these responses into the restoration stages. So this is a framework that categorizes the different stages, I guess, or steps of a restoration project. So it starts out with the planning and design phase. So pretty self-explanatory. You plan out what you're going to restore and where and design how you're going to do it. Step two is the implementation phase when you actually are doing the restoration activities. Step three is a bit of a mouthful: management, documentation, evaluation, and reporting. And that is kind of the management and reporting back, evaluating how the project has gone. And then the fourth one is monitoring. After the project has been and the site has been restored and the project has been implemented, how do we follow up and see how it's doing over time? And it's kind of a little bit of a circular framework, since restoration projects ultimately should have a monitoring aspect to it, and it's not just a linear thing. So with that in mind, I took those themes from that strengths graph a few slides ago, and I categorized them into these stages. So see here in blue, planning and design. Down here, these are the stages, or the themes rather, that I thought based on the answers fit into that stage. Implementation is over here. Management, documentation, evaluation, reporting is here. And then post-implementation monitoring is here. And then you'll see management is in the middle. And management is, which was also one of the largest, or the strengths that people referred to the most, that's involved in all four stages of the restoration framework, which is interesting. Also, the planning and design phase over here had the most strengths associated with it. And then broad focus over here as well is also in the planning and design stage. So the flip side of the strengths, I also want to see what are some weaknesses of current or past restoration projects in Ontario. So this is a very similar graph to the one for strengths is the weaknesses of these projects. And finances is one of the largest ones, which is tied also with maintenance. So for finances, people indicated that financial struggles were a weakness of how these projects were and a barrier to them being able to do these projects well. And then maintenance was also a weakness as well. Many people implied that a lot of these projects were implemented and weren't maintained or monitored very well after the initial restoration was done. Similarly, categorize the weaknesses into the different restoration stages. Same as before, planning and design is where most of the weaknesses were, excuse me, were categorized. But you can see here that invasive species is one that people mentioned that touches on a lot of different stages, as well as management touches on a lot as well. And you can see finances, which was one of our top ones, was here in planning and design. And then maintenance is the sole one here in post-implementation monitoring. So that's maintaining the site after the restoration project has been implemented. All right, so then I wanted to look at question 2. What does this mean for the future and how can these projects be improved going forward? So I asked about what are some ways, some technical ways that these projects can be improved. And so by technical improvements, I mean things with, for example, what seed mixes, if you're going to do a spread a seed mix for your grassland, what seed mix are you going to use? On the ground kind of things like that. You can see some examples here as well in the figure. But the one that overwhelmingly was an area identified that people want improved is management and monitoring. Now, those are both very broad topics, but it was one that came up in a lot of different responses. Um, and this is interesting because if you remember from a few slides ago, management was also seen as one of the top strengths in this in grassland restoration projects. So there's a little bit of an interesting story going on there. So similarly, technical improvements were organized. Most of them have to do with planning and design of a project, while management and monitoring, which was that largest improvement, that relates to all of the stages. And then interestingly, nobody mentioned any technical improvements that had to do with the post-implementation stage. That might be due to the fact that technical issues and the technical aspect of a restoration project, generally, a lot of that is over by the time you're reporting and monitoring on it. So similarly, I also asked what are some logistical ways that these projects can be improved. So it has to do with funding, selecting a site, sharing information, things like that. And overwhelmingly, finances were a major area of improvement. And similarly to what we saw in the weaknesses, finances are a sticking point for these projects and for the people who are managing them. So here, when we organize them, they're all pretty distinctly organized into their own stages. There's not really any overlap. And then you can see finances is here in the planning and design stage. So in summary, our strengths of our restoration projects in Ontario tend to be management and that they have a broad focus, um, while our weaknesses really are financial, and the ability for these projects to be maintained after they're implemented. Some ways that they can be improved. We have some technical improvements in how these projects are managed and monitored, which seems to contrast with one of the current strengths of these projects. So there definitely is more to the story there. And it's like any restoration project or any project with species at risk or declining species, there's always more to the picture and more to talk about. And there's a complex system. So it's definitely an interesting finding there. And then logistical improvements is probably something that is familiar to a lot of those who work in ecological restoration or any kind of nature-based industry, is that financing and funding is always a struggle to get those grants and those money to actually do the work that we want to do. Um, so that's my presentation. It's a very quick overview of my research, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has anything. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Claire. I know with these webinars, it's always nice. Sometimes people prefer to listen. Sometimes people prefer, though, to ask questions, have a discussion. We have an audience, which is always nice. Again, a lot of people like to listen to this on YouTube and watch it. However, I do invite, of course, anybody who's actually on the call to ask anything you want of Claire, or to initiate a discussion. We can do that as well. There may or may not be. Don't feel pressure or anything like that. I have a couple of things I can ask, but that's because I'm an academic. We do that sort of thing, right? I'll give it a.
So I did have a question. Sorry, I couldn't figure
Yeah.
out how to raise my hand.
Oh, that's okay,
Uh,
Aaron. Don't worry. Go ahead. You're amongst friends here. There's a nice little small audience, so it's all good. Go right ahead.
yes, I'm just wondering if you think that your findings are applicable to other types of restoration projects outside of just grasslands, or are these more grassland specific things that are coming up?
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously the survey was framed with the grasslands in mind, specifically grasslands in Ontario, but a lot of the themes that emerged seem to be pretty general, and I wouldn't be surprised if restoration projects in other areas or in other ecosystems have similar issues. So broad things like management styles, funding, even I didn't really touch on some of the themes there, but some's with land acquisition. So you want to restore, do a restoration project, but it's hard to find the actual physical land in order to do this. And where does that come from? And working with stakeholders and land ownership. So yeah, there's a lot of really broadly applicable things. And then there were some responses that were pretty grassland specific, like I mentioned, what seed mix do you use, and cold season versus warm season plants, and then things like that. But yeah.
Excellent. Aaron or others, if you want to follow up or ask other questions, by all means.
Yeah, I do have a follow up, and this is maybe outside of the scope, but it's been something that's pretty prominent, or a prominent thought that I've been having for a bit about restoration. I work with the Georgian Bay Land Trust, and so a lot of the properties that we protect are already in a fairly natural state, not no restoration required. But I'm wondering what kind of thought climate change is going into restoration with the idea of species moving further north. So we have, for example, red-headed and red-bellied woodpeckers moving into our area. And a consideration I have to make is, should we be doing a restoration of our natural property to be encouraging or providing habitat for these species? So is that going into some of these restoration projects planning, or is that something that's still kind of going unnoticed?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. The topic of climate and range shifts didn't come up a whole lot in the responses to my survey, but I definitely I hear what you're saying, and I think that's kind of like the million-dollar question for a lot of us in the ecology field is what do we do for the future if we know that climate change is happening and in birds and especially the species you mentioned there we are seeing a lot of rapid and drastic range shifts north. And so what does that mean? Especially if there's a disconnect between the species are moving north or the bird species are moving north, but the plant community is a little bit slower to catch up. So yeah, I don't have an answer, but it's definitely something to think about. And I think a lot of people are starting to think about that as well.
If I may, I'd say yes, that you actually should be doing that. I'm regarded as a bit of a heretic amongst the parent organizations, the Society for Ecological Restoration. They don't like the novel ecosystem stuff or anything like that. But Aaron, you raised an important point: is that we, think about restoration, conservation, whatever we want to do. Actually, for current conditions, but climate change is becoming so rapid that you often have to think about providing habitat or providing at least opportunities for that for the future. So my recommendation is almost always to do so. Um, I'm not always convinced that assisted migration is quite yet what we need, but there are others who actually are. For a lot of us, it sort of tends to be more about preparation. I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie, who's got a question.
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. Thinking of opportunities for restoration and conservation, I wanted to ask if any of the projects that you looked at were related to urban parks and whether they were related or not, if you see any potential in our city parks to provide habitat for these species to be areas for restoration of grasslands.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So my my survey was anonymous, so a lot of that fine-grained details about exactly what projects people are working on and if they're an urban park or another urban project. A lot of that was a bit masked, and you can kind of read between the lines of some of the answers, but a lot of it's pretty open-ended. But that being said, I definitely think personally that there's opportunities for grassland restoration on those smaller scales and in urban settings. I know I've seen examples of that. For example, in London, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but when I was last there in like 2019, 2020, there was a Eastern Meadowlark restoration project beside the hospital there. They just had a big lawn essentially, but they were letting it go wild, and there were meadowlarks there. So clearly that's working, and that's a fairly urban setting. It's right next to a very big road, and all that. So there's definitely opportunities for that. Another thing with a lot of these grassland birds is there's a bit of debate about how area sensitive they are. So you'll have some studies saying that a species needs X number of hectares, 30 hectares, in order to breed successfully, whereas others will say that that same species needs as something as little as 5 hectares in order to have a successful breeding season. So it's a lot of it is we're still learning, especially in Ontario. We're still learning about these species and their habitat needs and size requirements and things like that. There's a lot of information about species elsewhere in Canada and in the States, but Ontario is a little bit different, and we don't have quite the breadth of knowledge for grassland bird species in Ontario that we do have elsewhere in the continent. So, yeah, but I personally think that urban areas can play a really important part.
Agree. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Excellent. Are there any other questions or discussion points people want to raise? Claire, I'll ask one briefly. I always like these sorts of studies because they give me a great deal of insight in what was really it's a small sampling universe. I don't mean that's criticism. I mean, that's just the way it is at the end of the day. Um, were you surprised at the results or anything like that, do you think?
Um, there were some things that I was surprised at. Um, for example, I was surprised with, um, again, I didn't really touch on it in this presentation, but there were some people who uh, disagreed, I guess, with one another in the different responses
Sure.
about how to go about doing a restoration project. So
Right.
especially when it comes to technical improvements, some person would say
Right.
warm season grasses only, whereas others say no, we need cool season grasses, or the size requirements needed,
Right.
that there's too many areas that need to be improved to list them all. And some say that it's perfectly fine the way it is. So it really is. I mean, and with the study of this nature too, it's a person's opinion and it's their professional opinion, but um, it yeah, there is some of that context that needs to
Right.
be taken into account. But yeah, it is an interesting study just to see just get a snapshot of what people are who work in this space are saying. So I was surprised by a few things. A lot of things didn't surprise me though.
Right.
Yeah, like just
Finances.
sorry.
Finances.
Finances, yeah, no, finances didn't surprise me. And things with the overall organization and
Right.
follow up. Just from my career before I came to grad school as like a consultant, and you know, finances are always in the back of the brain, and if somebody's paying for
Right.
something, there's not necessarily the impetus to keep following up on something. There's not always the money there to do that.
Finances come
So
out in another way. I mean, I had a conversation regionally with federal partners, and they were actually said, well, we've identified, and they were kind of complaining about the fact there wasn't very much research being done in the hotspot areas they identified, which is southern BC, southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, southern Manitoba, southern Ontario, and so on and so on. And we pointed out, well, you cut all the programs for that. It's all in the boreal forest and the Arctic. And they went, oh. It's like, well, if you think it's important, then shouldn't you probably provide some funding for the biodiversity side of the equation? But it's kind of a conundrum. So the
yeah,
finances are even squoze even more, and of course they frozen most of these things over the last 15 years. So there's a whole pile of reasons why I think it comes up. I mean, it's a whole bunch of other reasons, obviously, too. Um, is there a brief question to end off? I will be respectful of everybody's time, including our presenter Claire. We have about a minute and a half. If not, I will sort of conclude us here.
I would just have a quick question
Sure,
of,
Aaron.
given a surplus of money and financing not being an issue, what is the most like valuable thing? Are we like, is restoration more valuable than land acquisition? Or, and maybe this is for everyone, if there is a surplus of money, where should we be putting that
Yep.
money?
yeah, no, good question. And that is something that I could see a little bit of a discord and within some of those responses too, with people saying that we don't need to necessarily restore for certain species, or the whole idea of shifting baselines, right? How I talked about grasslands in Ontario, they used to be at X level and then they skyrocketed post colonialization, and then now they've decreased. And so,
Right.
what is our baseline now, right? It's been
Right.
centuries. So, yeah, that's definitely a question as well, is how where this funding is going to go, is if it should go towards restoration for grassland birds. So, yeah, that's a good question.
If I were, I can speak as a restoration colorist, I would say land acquisition. And no, it's not because you're part of the land trust, Aaron, or or anybody else here. I would say that because that's the biggest problem is clear identify. You get 99% of the habitat loss, basically. I mean, so go along with the 9% loss there. So once you get the land, you can actually, if you do need to, it's actually relatively straightforward and template to do restoration. So I think it's an excellent question, and I would say that's probably the response. Folks, I'm going to wrap it up. I really thank you for your joining us today for the half an hour. Again, this will be posted up on YouTube, and a lot of others will end up seeing it, so that'll be out there. It'll be a reminder on our website, casiopa.ca, that it's up there. I will then provide sort of, a reminder where the link is. There's a little YouTube button at the top of this up top of our site, so it's easy to find. I'll have that up in a few days, and so we'll go from there. So again, thank you, Claire, for doing the presentation. It's much appreciated. And thank you to our guests for joining us today. With that, I will conclude, everybody, and wish you all, from at least from here, a good afternoon. Have a
All
good
right.
day,
Thank you
everybody.
very much for having me.
Thank you.